When I found out that you were going to be on that panel, I dissented, I stepped down, and to be honest, I did not want to meet you, let alone speak on a panel with you.
And she was like, I don't know why I'm on this panel. I'm not really a feminist. And then I immediately joked and said, I don't know why I'm on this panel. I'm not really a woman.
I'm Sienna May Heath, and this is Real Unity, where we explore the idea of a post-trans era. Today, I'm joined by Sara Higdon, veteran and post-trans creator, to discuss matters of principle and personal insight on the highly debated topic of gender identity.
Well, Sara, the story of us not meeting, I think, is actually more fascinating than the story of us finally meeting at Free the People's Christmas party. As you know, I was invited to speak on a women's panel at a women's summit in the freedom space, as we call it. And when I found out that you were going to be on that panel, I dissented, I stepped down, and to be honest, I did not want to meet you, let alone speak on a panel with you. But times have since changed. And when we met, I think the story of us not meeting was really a telling example of how much can get lost in translation and how connections and friendships, which would otherwise be fruitful and interesting, can get completely lost and forfeit, all because of misunderstandings online. Now, I'm curious, what was your experience like of being put on that panel? Because I learned that you weren't so much invited as you were just put on the panel. So what were some of your mixed feelings, and how did you introduce yourself on the panel, and why do you think your voice was so valuable there?
Yeah, so obviously it was the name of the panel was Why Free Speech is a Feminist Issue. And it was at the Wilder Summit at Freedom Fest, 2022, 23? 2022.
Too.
And yeah, it was interesting because I had talked to the organizers. I was going to be speaking at Freedom Fest, and kind of the way it had happened was I didn't know what panel they were going to put me on. I was still a very young content creator. I really didn't have that much of a following online yet. And this was kind of, and honestly, it was one of my it was actually the first big speaking event that I had ever done. And so when I got put on this panel, I had the same, it was funny, when we were talking about it, I had the reservations that you did. I said, I said, is this right for me to be speaking on this panel on women's issues in the Women's Summit? And I started talking around to other people in the space, other people that have been in the space for a very long time, other women in the space. And really what I kind of came down to was that it might have been the perfect panel for me to speak at, because my goal in my activism, my content, everything like that, is to kind of bridge the gap between the trans community and mostly women, because that's where a lot of the divide is right now, what we're seeing. And so my goal was to go in there and show that all trans people are not these crazy lunatics that we see, online, that are creating a lot more issues for trans people. And so what better place for me to go and to speak to women about this, and show women this, than at the Women's Summit. And so that's why I ended up going and speaking at that event. And it was really interesting because, like I said, the topic was why free speech is a feminist issue. And there was not a single feminist other than Avens O'Brien on the panel, and she was the moderator. But I had met Olivia Rondeau that weekend too. That was the first time we had ever met. And it was funny because we were talking about this before the panel, and she was like, I don't know why I'm on this panel. I'm not really a feminist. And then I immediately joked and said, I don't know why I'm on this panel. I'm not really a woman. And so it was a joke. It kind of set the mood for how it was. And yeah, introducing myself on the panel. I don't exactly remember what I said to introduce myself on the panel. I just made it known that yes, I'm trans, and this is what I think, and this is why I'm here. And really, that speaking on that panel is where I met the Kibbies, which is now why I work here at Free the People. So at the end of the day, it really worked out for the best. And I think it ended up being a pretty good conversation, especially since a lot of my activism has been, from the very beginning of my content, I started speaking against males and female sports, and that was a big topic that came up, especially with Olivia being a wrestler on the and a former athlete on the panel. Me and her talked about that quite a bit, and so it really wove into the idea of what this panel was about, and why I'm out here speaking against a lot of the radical trans activism out there.
Well,
and also I will say that. I also, when I looked at it, I said, is this really a women's panel, or is it a panel for women? Which are two different things, because a panel of women would have been wrong for me to take that spot. But Freedom Fest could have had a male gynecologist on that panel and said, was that wrong for him to take away that spot either? I don't know. That was up for them to decide.
I said something similar. It's funny because I thought we were so starkly different, but back then I said something similar. I said, why not? And I have to admit, I said it tongue in cheek in my letter, but I said, well, why not have a man, like why not have Matt Walsh or, whoever, on the panel? Like, let's just make it more diverse, so to speak. But, that aside, you being a veteran and then having an athlete on the panel, and then we have everyone except for Avens not even identifying as a feminist, it already starts to break the labels, right? The labels of, well, even woman, feminist, and so forth. And you're breaking the label of trans and saying that you're in your post-trans era, which is so fascinating, because I think that as we see the pendulum swing, this issue of gender identity matters more than ever. It's a hot button issue still, but then in some ways it doesn't matter. Could you say more about what it means to be post-trans, why the topic matters to you and why it doesn't?
Yeah, it is interesting. So I kind of came up with this concept. I've been wanting to move kind of past using like trans labels for a little while now, and I didn't really know what to how to label myself. I don't like the labels because, like, you're right, it doesn't matter so much in terms of like my everyday life, but in terms of when we're having these conversations, what do you use? And right now, we're not speaking the same language between the people that we disagree with. And so you have to have set definitions in order for you to even talk about these conversations. And so, the trans community has never really liked me because I speak against a lot of what they believe in. And a lot of like, there's a lot of strong, I use the term radical feminist because they're still like third wave feminists that are in that realm where they don't like me very much because whatever reasons they have against all trans people, they don't think trans is valid. They don't think gender dysphoria is a real mental health issue per se. So what can I do to start bridging the gap with those areas? And the biggest thing is we need to move past gendered language. So right now, gender is pretty much a meaningless term. The postmodernists, the queer theorists, they have taken the language so much that they've muddied the waters that what ends up happening, we have conversations with people, and so take the sports issue. If we're talking about males and female sports, and you notice I say males and female sports because sex-based language is much more effective to talk about it. Now, if I said men and women's sports, most people would understand what that means. But then what ends up happening is postmodernists or even just regular leftists will say, well, trans women are women, and so they should be competing in women's sports. And then you ask them what a woman is, and they really don't have a definition for it. And so if I say, if the average person names it, males and that a woman is a adult human female, then you would look at that, and that's the way that most people would say it, but you end up arguing about what the word woman means instead of why males shouldn't be competing in female sports. And so moving into the post-trans era, I think it's important because a lot of it takes away a lot of that, the language traps from both sides, because like I said, if I call myself a trans woman, the radical feminist in this instance would say you're no type of woman, and you can't change sex, so there's no such thing as trans. And so then we start arguing about what the definitions is and why trans women are a subsection of men, for example. But it doesn't matter how many times you say that, it still comes back to the same thing. And so just to say that I'm a male that presents female, or that has done extreme body modification to change my appearance into a way that makes me feel more comfortable, that is much more beneficial to the conversation than just saying I'm a trans woman, which is, everybody's got a different definition for it.
Yes, and thank you for clarifying the usefulness of the male and female labels rather than men and women. Of course, they both have their merits, what we believe are objective definitions, but for conversation's sake, saying male and female sports can be more unifying. And you mentioned queer theory. I think it's important to distinguish between queer theory and gender identity theory. So queer theory, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's that the belief that gender is fluid, it's a social construct, it's kind of like a performance. And I don't mean that in a degrading sense, but like presenting as such. And some say that queer theory is rather hostile to biological science. So it's kind of like an enforcer kind of theory. And gender identity theory also enforces some other things, but it enforces that gender is innate, you have a sex brain, you have sort of an essence or perhaps a genderless or a gendered soul. So it's almost like a religion, and it's honestly very fascinating to me because the belief in genderless souls really holds up. I think that might be possible. But likewise with gender identity theory, we have the common assertion that trans women are women, and the emphasis on gender affirming care, as they call it, considering disagreements as transphobia. The list just goes on. And of course, we've seen enforced speech. So that also is related to like the freedom of speech angle of this issue. How do you see like queer theory versus gender identity theory at play as the sort of gender wars are going on?
Well, I would say so gender ideology is in a subcategory of queer theory. So queer theory is an overarching theory that's within the critical theories, which is if you look at it, it's very similar to critical race theory. And all critical theories in general, they're all tied together with intersectionality. But basically it's a postmodern theory where the easiest way to describe postmodernism would be that they don't believe in absolute truths. So your truth is the truth. And so that's where things get messy. And that's why when you talk about like different sciences, they don't really care about the sciences because they think that, sex is fluid, sex is a social construct. They think all these different things. And that's the biggest one, is that it's a social construct that you can create. And if you say you are, then you are. Which is quite interesting. But the issue with queer theory is you can just self-ID into it. Like obviously with critical race theory, you are the race that you are, and you can't just self-ID into that category. And so, and also with queer theory is they you can, what is it? It's not as developed. So critical race theory was developed like in the 60s or 70s. I don't know exactly the timeline on that, where the early queer theory started to be developed more and more by like Judith Butler in the early 90s, and gendered study courses in universities. And so it's very undeveloped, and so they can make it whatever they want it to be. They can say that's not queer theory, this is queer theory, this is what you're talking about. And so it's very undeveloped. But when you really look at the tenets and you look at the things that they say online and what they do, you can line it up and you can actually see that it goes down the same tenets as something like critical race theory that is developed. And that's how, but again, and that's how they've circumvented it into education with children. Gender ideology in and of itself, like you're right, it's quite interesting that it does present very much like a religion. Like you have to believe in this. It's not something that is just innate in facts and in truth. It's something that you just inevitably believe. And it is interesting because when they say that, you know, that you're a boy trapped in a girl's body, or a boy trapped in a girl's body, or a boy trapped in a, did I just say a girl trapped in a boy's body? That's believing that you have a soul and that your soul is something different than what your body is. And then they'll say that the brain studies. Now, the issue with the brain studies is they think that the science is on their side, because there have been studies that have shown that trans people in general, their brains do function and look like, the matter in the brain does look more like that of the opposite sex. The issue with it is the study was very small. It was actually accidentally found. And what they failed to mention is that when you look at those brain studies, gay men, for example, have the same quote female brain as a trans person. Now, I think that there's things that we can look at that explain what's happening there. And we know, so like Deborah So wrote in her book End of Gender about the studies that showed a hormone imbalance in the womb has been linked to homosexuality. And I do believe that there could be a possibility that same hormone imbalance could be linked to gender dysphoria, but just going a little bit further. Because like for most people, I always say most trans people that I know who are happy in their transition, they knew from a very early age that they wanted to be the opposite sex. It's funny because I knew from a very early age that I wanted to be a girl, but I knew that I wasn't, you know? And so it was like, I knew I wasn't feeling like something like some out of body experience, that I was like in the wrong body. So I don't believe the idea that you can be born in the wrong body. I do believe that there's something in the brain that says, I wish I was born this. I wish I was born a girl. I wish I was developing like a girl. I wish I was treated more like that. And I wish I could be that. And it was something that was not normalized back then. So it was something that we hid. Now, so every transsexual that I know who's happy with going through the process, that was the case. And then it persisted into adulthood. And because it's relatively recent that they're even allowing minors to go through these procedures, when it persists into adulthood, that's really pretty much when I believe that you can actually have a good diagnosis on gender dysphoria. Was it persistent at like the very earliest memories, and did it persist into adulthood? Like it has to persist to adulthood before you can even start thinking about transitioning and taking hormones and having surgeries and stuff.
Yes, and I'm glad that you brought up the hormone imbalances possibly rooted in pregnancy. So there's two places we can go with that. One is the medicalization of children, which of course happens later, and then we can look back at the link and now the breakage between gay rights and the TQ of LGBTQ. So starting with children. of course, I think it's widely acknowledged that there's a social contagion, there's an enforcement in culture that says, yes, of course, you can be born in the wrong body, or at the very least, it's valid if you want to become a girl or if you want to become a boy. But there's more emphasis on like you're born in the wrong body, as in like you're not okay with how you were born into this world. And now actually you're educating me on possible hormone imbalances, because maybe there is truth to that. But we've seen, of course, there's a lot of empathy on both sides for these children, and there's a lot of concern because we don't want children unaliving themselves, and we don't want them unaliving themselves through the risks of these surgeries. So it's complicated. But I think on both sides, at times, it doesn't seem so complicated because it's either one or the other. Essentially, though, when it comes down to principle, I think the principle is informed consent. Are these children and their parents getting informed consent? And do the parents even have the information as far as what's happening in the schools? Do we have teachers affirming another gender, calling the kids by a different name? And likewise, we have empathy coming from those who call themselves allies. So it's a very tense issue, but I think it's one that's so emotionally charged and very much charged with compassion, which is, I think, in essence, a unifying sentiment. Could you speak more on like the compassion that you see on both sides? And also, as someone who has effectively transitioned, how do you discern, just in your opinion, between people who are getting caught up or people who actually are what you would say trans?
Yeah. So on the first part, the compassion thing, it is really, really interesting to see, because I think you have to understand that people on both sides that are really just fighting for what's best for children. I think a lot of people on the pro transing kids side, they think, like you said, that they truly believe that children will unalive themselves. I think that's a manipulation tactic that has been used, and they but they believe it. And they also believe somehow that minors can consent to these things. Like they know, like that's what they're told, is they know from a very young age that they know. And so I do say that, yes, we know from a very young age that something is different and that we might want to be of the opposite sex. However, I always kind of use the analogy that a square is a rectangle, but a rectangle is not a square. So meaning that just because a child at a very young age thinks that they want to be the opposite sex, it doesn't make it true. In fact, we know that about 90% of the time they grow out of it by the time that they hit adult. Like by the time that they hit 20, about 90% end up desisting. And so in most cases, puberty is the cure. What we've seen a lot of too is that, but we've seen there has been a big social contagion aspect to the gender affirming model. So when you see that in about 2016, 2017 timeframe, the number of people identifying as in a trans category skyrocketed. What's interesting about those numbers is it wasn't males that it skyrocketed. The males went up a little bit, but for the most part, it was like 500% females that skyrocketed. And a lot of that is when do we start seeing the rapid onset gender dysphoria that Abigail Shrier wrote about in Irreversible Damage? It's around, you start seeing these things around 11, 12, 13, around that time when a female would normally go through puberty. We also see that, and from my understanding is, nobody likes puberty, not even, males don't like puberty either, but especially I've been told that females, especially, it's really a difficult time in a young female's life. And so they want to opt out of that. That's what they're trying to do, is opt out of that. Sometimes there's a high propensity for something like autism. There's a lot of comorbidities, mental health issues going on there. And so from people that I know that have Asperger's, that have talked to me about this, is that they would say that, if they were going through this now, they would have fixated on being trans because they didn't think that they were female enough, that they were feminine enough to be a woman, and so that they would think that would make them a boy. So Chloe Cole's a prime example. That's what she started looking at Instagram models and was like, well, that's not me. I'm never going to be that. So maybe I'm actually a boy. We also see a high percentage of these young females have been sexually assaulted. And so again, why would you want to be sexualized as a young female? And so you start to opt out of it. And I think that's where I think a lot of the people that are pushing this are lacking that compassion in that regard, because they're not really looking at the other comorbidities that are actually happening. And this is where I lose a lot of faith in the medical community in and of itself. Like you mentioned informed consent. I think we are having a issue across the board with especially mental health professionals. And it's really, it's so mental health professionals, I do think that there's like three types of them out there that are pushing these types of things. There's the type that actually think that this is the right process to go through. There's the type that thinks that that is literally just doing it because they know it's a big money maker, as we heard out of a senior person at Vanderbilt. And then I do believe that there, just across the board, there's a lack of, I don't know if it's just not being trained properly or if it's laziness, but not even just with gender dysphoria, we are seeing therapists just throw pills at issues. We're seeing doctors throw pills at issues and saying, this is what's going to happen. We're seeing SSRIs being prescribed at a much higher level than we've ever seen ever in this country, instead of just working on the root causes of things. So what are the other mental health comorbidities that could be leading to gender dysphoria? They're just saying, oh, that sounds like you might be a boy. Or they're implanting this idea into their patient's head and saying, well, maybe you're actually trans, and that's the issue that you're going through. And so then the person grabs onto that and then moves forward with it. And that's what they end up start doing. And like, even I just don't think we're giving people enough time to learn like the informed consent stuff. So, and learn what's going to happen, give them times. A lot of these young females are getting double mastectomies and then later learning that they can't breastfeed their children if they wanted to have kids. And so they need to learn and go through life a little bit more before they can get to that step. And going back to the compassion, I think that's why it's compassionate for people. The anti-transing kids side is compassionate in saying, we don't want these kids to sterilize themselves before they even hit, before they get through puberty, before they can even before they hit adulthood. When you're a teenager, of course you don't want kids, but then when you get into your 20s and 30s, then you start to want kids, and then you can't have them because of a mistake that you made when you were in your teens. And so it really, this is why it's really important that we get to adulthood. And like, even me, I came out in 2014. At the end of 2015, 2016 is when I kind of really started to see what exactly this feeling that I had been feeling my entire life was. And so I started moving into going out dressed and as a woman would appear. I was going out doing stuff like that, seeing if this would really make me feel better. This was 2016, 2017, when I got out of and this was only on weekends. So when I got out of the Army at the end of 2017, I moved to Atlanta, and it was basically every weekend I was going out like this. But it wasn't even until March of 2019 that I started taking hormones. And so you think from 2014 to 2019 is how long it basically took me doing research myself and figuring everything out to make sure that this is actually what I wanted to do. So for me to look at a child and think that they just started feeling this way, that they even have done any of the research and they're just being like fast tracked onto this, like it would have taken, if I had come out at 12, it would have still taken me till 18 to even start taking hormones myself. And that's me as an adult doing full research. And so that's where I think that there's just not enough information. I don't really have a lot of faith right now in the medical community that's pushing this.
Yeah, I think that lack of faith is fair and warranted. And I've noticed that on both sides, there's also this theme of dehumanization. On one side, it's with regard to pronouns or certain pronouns. If you don't use the pronouns I want you to use to refer to me or about me, then you're dehumanizing me. Okay, I understand. Like, I can comprehend that perspective. On the other hand, dehumanization, I think, is also done when one hinges their personhood on an ideology and also refrains from going on their own journey, as you did, for it sounds like about 5 years. I think that really robs a person of just themselves as a human, as an individual. And also, like as you mentioned, queer theory is postmodern, it's collectivist. I would say it's kind of robbing the individual of their individuality, because when you hinge yourself on a belief system and so quickly and so strictly, of course you're still a person, but are you really advocating for your own humanization?
Yeah, that's actually that's a good point. Because like when you start to, I mean, collectivism is a good word to describe the people that are in this ideology, because they are clinging to that ideology as if this is their identity. Like they're making their entire identity out of this. I always kind of say like this is like one of the least interesting things about me, and I don't really care too much about what people think of me in terms of that regard. I'm just living the life that makes me happy, and it's. I wish we could stop talking about this, because it's like I just want to move on, and that's kind of where the post-trans comes in too. But when it comes to like individuality, I think that, I mean, obviously we're more individualistic. So when it comes to like these people, it's really interesting because, they'll call me self-hating because of what I do and how I speak about these issues. They'll call me self-hating because they think that by admitting that I'm a male, which would make me a man, which makes it a subsection of men, they think that that is self-hating, which I would contend that would be the opposite, right? So if you're stuck in this cult mentality to where you are, your soul being is within this identity, and if somebody disrespects that identity, then it you melt down over it. Whereas me, I'm like, I accept my reality. I accept why I did this, and honestly, it's one of the most free to say exactly who I am is one of the most freeing experiences I can have. And honestly, it shuts down any criticism that people have of me, because it's like, talking online to things and talking about the dehumanization, when people come to me and they're like, "You're a man," I'm like, "Okay, so." Like it's literally robbing those people of their attacks against you. Like it's easy. I'm like, I freely admit this stuff. So why would I worry about how you refer to me? But it's like when you start talking about like pronouns or anything like that, you start talking about forcing people's language, which I don't believe in this at all. And it's one of those things like, we have a freedom of speech and freedom of association. Like, I don't have to associate with you if you are disrespectful. Now, there are people that I don't like to use their pronouns for, people that I don't really respect. I don't quote misgender them as we know the term. I'll just use their name though, because I don't really have the respect for them, but I also understand, again, how language works in this. So if I go out there and I, misgender somebody, then that ends up turning into the fight, right? People that are in the middle, their ears start to turn off. They start to think, well, this person's now cruel. I don't want to listen to them. I don't want to follow them. And so people that are in the center, that I would say that we could get onto our side and to make them understand about this stuff, it's the way that I choose to speak, because I think I can reach them. Also, just being who I am and what I've gone through, I think also can reach people as well. And so that you have to start to humanize people in that regard. Like, I think, yeah, if you, it doesn't make any sense to go out there and be cruel, because I think most people that are not on the internet, they don't want to be associated with people that are cruel. See, we live in this digital age to where the things that go viral really aren't the things that matter to the people, normal people.
I agree. Cruelty is a turnoff for most people, I would like to think. And I do see cruelty on both sides. I'd love to get your thoughts on the cruelty on quote unquote our side of the spectrum, if you will, the more gender critical side. I think what's turned me off from LGBTQ communities is the cruelty and the prerequisite for belonging, that you have to speak how we want you to speak. You have to think, to the point where you're enforcing how I must think. Sometimes I'll say, you know what, let me be wrong. If 10 years from now you can prove that a man can become a woman, fine. Let me be wrong. And let me say what I want to say within reason and think what I want to think. And looking more at the LGBTQ, I say community lightly because I know there's dissent and breakage. But when we see the LGBTQ plus IA, if you will, communities really forcing what they think, what they say, and what they feel on others. We see, for example, the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation change their definition from gay to same gender loving. And I mean, I don't want to go as far as to say that that's self-hating for a gay person to say. But it's a little absurd, and then I can understand the perspective more on that side of things, that there's the pushback on gender theory is similar to the pushback on homosexuality in decades past. So I don't know. I mean, I have my opinions, but I'm learning also to, I say respect as in just say, I can see where people are coming from when they say, I'm scared for my children, I'm scared for myself. And when a trans-identified person does get assaulted, I guess I kind of hear the sentiments of, well, that's rare, or was that really because they're trans? And when you hear these things, whether it's from one side or the other, that's perhaps self-hating or violence prone. I mean, what comes up for you as someone who identifies as trans?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's when looking at how, I guess, yeah, how the two sides. I mean, I would go back and say, I do think that there is a very clear divide between the LGBT, and I would say that the T would stand for transsexual and not transgender, because transgender is the umbrella term created under queer theory. So transsexual actually are the people, it was the old term that you had to that you had to have gender dysphoria and medicalized it to present and basically blend into society as though you were the opposite sex. And so I think that what queer theory has done is separated and it's separated in the middle of the T, to where, because of its postmodern ideology of queer theory, in reality, the LGB and T for transsexual doesn't exist in a postmodern world, right? So if they don't believe in absolute truths, they don't actually believe in homosexuality. They don't believe that, that in LG, they don't believe in gay, lesbian, trans. They say they do, but then they try to tell you that if you're a lesbian and you won't date a trans person, with male genitalia, then you're transphobic. And so that is showing that they are in a lot of ways they are homophobic, because they will say, because they will try to force same-sex attracted people to date people of same-sex attraction. And so I would say that that's where the divide happens, is the Q. I hardly ever, when I discuss these things, I say that either the queer community or I say the LGBT community, which, again, the LGBT community really isn't much of a community in and of itself anymore either, because the acceptance, because for the most part, homosexuality has been accepted in the West. And so when you look at like gays and lesbians, they really don't have as much in common. It's like they're not dating the same people. So like gays are dating men, and lesbians are dating women, and and so it's like when they go out to a bar, they're not really going out to the same bars to meet the same people. So it almost makes sense for everybody to kind of dissipate. And the pride parades and the pride stuff has become queer fest instead of LGBT acceptance places, right? But it is interesting looking at people on, the right side of the aisle. And I think this has ramped up a little bit, pushing the LGB without drop the T type stuff. And it's really hard, because I have had people that I was close with and respect become actually quite cruel with the things that they say about trans people. And it really is like judging the entire population of trans people by the actions of a few activists that they see online, right? And that's what we're seeing. I mean, we're seeing it in a lot of other communities online. And again, it is kind of this digital space that we have, is that we see the worst actors within groups that get the most attention, and that's what we judge our opinions on those people on. But I would argue that a lot of transsexuals are not speaking out as much. They're not speaking out at all, because they live stealth lives, and they don't want to, come out of those stealth bubbles just to be treated cruelly by both sides. And so it becomes a difficult situation to be in. Now, I would say, though, to anybody who has a question as to why LGB and T should be together, I think it's pretty simple. I think the reason why that they were placed together in the first place was because, so if I'm trans, so I present the way I do. If I start dating a woman, that's a heterosexual relationship. So technically it's a straight relationship, and I wouldn't belong to the LGB, because the T is an identity, it's not a sexuality. However, if me and said girlfriend were walking down the street, what types of I guess bigotry, what type of what would the people on the street see? They would see what would be a homosexual relationship and have the biases against that. And that's why in the early, in the 80s and 90s, they would be treated the same way as they would probably not be accepted, because they would be treated as a homosexual relationship, even though it's not. Flip that to the other side. You have, if I'm dating a man, then it's a homosexual relationship. So technically it would be under the G, it would fall under the gay relationship. So it would be in the community. But then the people on the outside would see it as a straight relationship. And so it probably wouldn't receive the same biases as the G as it would if it was seen as a gay relationship. And so that's the reason why I would say that trans people typically still identify with the LGBT community and can understand the discriminations that you would receive if you were in, one of those types of relationships. And it's almost like no matter what relationship you're in, you're going to receive the same type of discriminations, which again, we're in 2025 and I don't really deal with these on a daily basis. It is really interesting because I do think most of the stuff that we're talking about only really happens online. Because I traveled the country. I've been to small towns, big towns, and I've literally never had issues in person. The only time I have had any issues with any type of people saying something is when somebody is attracted to me and then I tell them I'm trans and then they're not very happy about that. But other than that, I don't think it's an issue that the general population really sees as an issue. And unfortunately, when we go back to like the sports issues, I think that some people write it off and say, well, there's only so many. It's not a lot. But then the other side would say, and I would agree with and say, well, one trans person taking a spot and taking an award away from a woman is an issue, and it's in a violation of Title IX.
That's kind of what I said about our panel.
Yeah, I get it.
Coming full circle there, but yeah. What I'm hearing is about perception, and kudos to you for being able to juggle all that language and define LGBT as it's separate from the Q being gender theory. But really, like, so much of what you're describing is perception, how a certain couple would be perceived and perhaps treated. And when you mentioned discrimination, you also suggested that much of that is in the past. And there's a distinction to be made between discrimination and prejudice, or what's simply ignorance. I would hope that we're not seeing active discrimination against gay and trans people, just to put it simply. However, as the pendulum swings, what sentiments and even actions are you seeing from effectively the right that perhaps are concerning?
Yeah, that's absolutely true, though. Like, there are increased prejudices against trans people, I think, right now, especially because, and even we've seen just the acceptance rate of LGBT people start to drop, and I think that's an issue. We've seen state legislators across the country, most notably, I think Utah has asked the Supreme Court to relook at the Oberfeld ruling, which was same-sex marriage. So that's what put it into law, that it was legal in all 50 states. So we're seeing them possibly looking at that. Do I think it's going to go anywhere? I don't. Same with we're seeing in Texas. So Texas, HB 5533, I think is the number of the bill. That's the bill that banned any minor from being able to take hormones or have surgery in the state of Texas, which is a bill I agree with. Well, this year a legislator has filed this an amendment to the bill to make it so that adults can't even do that in the state of Texas. Now, it's not going to pass. I don't even think it's going to make it to committee from the people from that lobbyists that I know in Texas. But it is something that we would have never seen a few years ago. And so I think with more visibility, because again, we didn't really see or hear about trans people. We knew they existed forever, but we didn't really see or know about them like in the public eye until 2017, when the North Carolina passed the bathroom bill. Well, started with Charlotte, North Carolina passed the first self-ID bathroom bill or bathroom ordinance, and then the state passed the ban on the whole bathroom bill stuff. And so but that's where all this kind of kicked off, and it's like as we get more visible, it's like every single thing a trans person does is in the public eye now, and so the perception online is now, we see a lot of trans activists committing violent crimes, just like we've seen across the board with different leftist organizations in the past. But we're seeing all this now. The trans violence, Antifa has basically rebranded as Trantifa, and it's like that is causing everybody to look at even somebody like me and be like, you're mentally ill and violent. You shouldn't be in general society. And that's kind of seems to be a perception that is starting to come more and more. And prejudices are being made because of it. Which is, again, why I actually feel more comfortable and need to be out here more speaking about this stuff, because to dismantle those prejudices, right? To stop, to when people find my content, me or Blair White or Buck Angel or any of us, they're like, oh, wait a second, they're not all like this. There are some rational people out here. And I would say, I used to think that it was the majority of transsexuals were the rational people that, like I said, don't want to come out of their bubbles because of these prejudices. But now I'm not so sure, because a lot of the trans activists that we see online, a lot of them are transsexuals. So it's in the sense, even other than like the Trantifa stuff, it's like they're the non-binary activists that they have a personality and not really a disorder. So it's really difficult to fight that off, and I see it moving on the right. The one good thing that I think right now, though, is like, so Donald Trump is friends with Caitlyn Jenner, and I think that actually helps a lot to make me feel more comfortable that there's not going to be this like huge resurgence against trans people, because one of the most prominent trans people in the country has the president's ear. But after Trump is out of office, how does that move forward? I don't know.
And we really don't know. And seeing the anti-gay sentiments at the government level, at least at the state level, I think that's worthy of consideration. And when you mentioned that bathroom bill, I forgot about that. It was in about 2016. A couple years before that, I was working with a friend who was identifying as a trans woman, and he was very passionate about telling their story. And I think that's what I really loved about her. And in this case, I'll use the pronoun. I really loved that she wanted to tell her story. And we found out we actually had a mutual friend, and they went to high school together, Performing Arts High School. And I just found her self-expression to be very humanizing. And I never remembered her forcing her beliefs or forcing her pronouns on others. At the time, it really wasn't a contentious issue. And like that was my first experience with a transsexual or transgender person. And just thinking about like the difference between then and now. Now we have this enforcement that you can be born in the wrong body. You can be dead named. Actually, I want to stop there. I'm curious what you think about dead naming, calling someone by their former name.
So, I hate the term dead name because it's not accurate. I think it gives the wrong perception about what's going on there, right? But it comes from this idea that when a person starts taking hormones and starts their transition, that the person that they were before has died. Like that's not who they are. That's not who they are anymore. They've died and they've become this new person. It's really a weird and almost morbid idea. Whereas I don't like it. I think, it's interesting because I have no issues. Like if you walk through my house, my old name is everywhere. I don't call it a dead name. I call it my old name. My old name's everywhere. I would say though, so I don't prefer, I obviously don't like people to use it. And most obviously people that didn't know me before don't use it. But it also takes time for people to get used to. So like my family, some people in my family will still use my old name, and it is what it is. I don't really worry too much about it. I'm not, it doesn't really affect me any which way. It's the name I use for a very long time. I will say though that, like, especially going online, purposely using somebody's old name just to be mean, the intention there is completely different. I think that is wrong. Now I will say the first time that I saw somebody that really didn't like me very much use my old name online, because this is this is something I do have an issue with. I've seen people on the right start to make this say, no, you should not use their new name. I'm like, it's my legal name. I've changed my name. You would use somebody's legal last name and then they got married, right? So that's kind of the same thing for me. But when I saw somebody use my old name online, it did make me feel a certain way. And it wasn't that they were using my old name. It was that they were using a name that connects me to so many other things. It almost to me felt like doxing, because I was not a public person before I started. I was not a public person before I started taking hormones and changed my name. And so the fact that they went online, they searched all my stuff and found my old name. And my old name for a long time was the only way that you could find my address. And so to me, it's the only way that you could find a lot of stuff about me. And so for me, it felt like when they posted that, it felt like they were doxing me in a lot of ways. And so I cringe when I see people use anybody's old name in that regard. And I do think that it is like one of those things, like, it doesn't make sense because you can legally change names, right? I can legally change my name just like we do when somebody gets married. I think it's the same respect that you would show somebody that got married and use their new name.
I would love to talk more about that in part 2. And just to end on the note of your post-trans era, how would you recommend that the country gradually move into a post-trans era, and what would that look like?
The post-trans era would come down to, again, gender language. Either we come up together and come up with, which I don't see happening, either we come together and come up with an idea or come up with set definitions for gendered language and what these definitions mean. So what is a woman? What's a man? We come up with a clear definition of what those are. That is not a circular definition that actually means something, which I don't see that happening. And so I think at the end of the day, I do think that we need to start using fact-based language, sex-based language, and just say, you know what? For me personally, it's like, I'm just Sarah. I don't really care what these labels that you place on me. I don't care if you call me trans or you call me a male, you call me a man. It doesn't matter. I think it disarms a lot of that language and it takes away some of the cruelty that we were talking about. I think if you can just look at somebody as an individual instead of part of a group, that's where it comes from. I think that's what we need to move towards as a society, is looking at people as individuals and not collectivize people. Because even people that are, libertarian and individualistic will still put people in a box and make them part of a collective that they never wanted to be in.
Well said. And also worthy of exploration in our next episode. In the meantime, where can people find you?
Yeah, so you can find me, you can just go to my website, sarahhigdon.com. You can go to, on X and on Instagram, it's Sara Higdon with an underscore. And then my YouTube channel is just Sara Higdon. So, but my website has all my links. It has some of my, my other works and stuff on there too. So that's probably the best place to find me out across the board.
Excellent. Well, until next time.